Without further delay, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the day, John McCall with John McCall Law Works, LLC. John is an attorney of over 23 years. Through his own practice, he works on all aspects of criminal and civil law, including high-level drug trafficking and homicide cases. He is also very active in our medical cannabis community and has worked on several medical cannabis issues as well. So thank you, John, for joining us today.
Thank you, Monique. Cool. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's good to know that this is being recorded for people going forward, because there are going to be more and more people coming into this industry. I started, just to give you some history of cannabis and hemp in New Mexico, it kind of paralleled my law school career, because when I started in law school in 1994, I went to work for state representative at the time, later Senator Cisco McSorley. And my primary goal as an intern in his office was to get a medical cannabis law passed in New Mexico. And I started working on that while I was his intern, and we continued developing it, and we got it into the legislature around the year 2000. And ultimately that law became the medical cannabis statute for the state of New Mexico. And by that time I had become an attorney, but I also was very much involved in the New Mexico Industrial Hemp Growers Association, which was an organization that was lobbying the legislature at the time with regards primarily to industrial hemp. And I drafted legislation at that time in the wake of the Owens case in New Hampshire, which provided for the 0.3% THC or less legalization of hemp. So that the first draft I did of that bill was around 2002 or so, and it was right after our medical cannabis bill started getting introduced, and it took years for each of these to become law. In 2007, I think it was, the medical cannabis bill eventually became law, and then the industrial hemp bill was just a couple of years ago. But when I originally drafted that, gosh, I didn't even realize it was like 16, 17 years ago. So it's kind of funny that industrial hemp was behind, but when we were advocating for it, we always would tell the legislators that the real reason that this stuff, that cannabis and hemp were made illegal, was because of the economic threat of hemp to the rayon and other textile industries. So it was not just the psychotropic aspects of cannabis. Now we're in this golden age of hemp being legal to grow again. So hopefully, like places like Nebraska and Kansas will no longer be destroying acres of hemp that are growing wild on the side of the road like they were for the last 30 or 40 years. Crazy, crazy. And we're also in the age of the growing understanding of the medicinal uses of hemp and cannabis in CBD and THC. So the law governing this is in a state of flux, and it has been for quite some time. When Brian Crum, who was a co-author of the bill with me, many of you probably know, he's a psychiatric nurse practitioner here in New Mexico. He filed a rescheduling petition with the DEA that was pending for years and years and years, and we finally ended up in court on that in 2009. It was very auspicious because it was right when Barack Obama took office. And so at the end of the hearing, where the judge basically denied the rescheduling petition, I went and talked to some of the DEA attorneys, and I said, well, Barack Obama said he was supporting medicinal cannabis, and you guys need to do something to reflect that, because your arguments in court are completely opposite of what he said when he was campaigning and when he became president. So in 2000, 2009, and I think it was May or June, I think it was the Attorney General, Eric Holder, came to Albuquerque and made an announcement that medical cannabis was not going to be prosecuted by the Department of Justice. And that began all the Cole memos and all of the things that have happened ever since then. It all began here in New Mexico. And New Mexico has always been a leader. It's certainly at that time, 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, New Mexico was considered to be one of the best examples of a legislative and administrative regime for medical cannabis. We fell behind. Of course, we had an election. We had another administration for 8 years that was very much opposed to hemp and cannabis. And this bill that we're celebrating now for hemp in New Mexico was basically vetoed by the governor, and the Supreme Court overturned her veto in order for people to start growing hemp. And so, and of course, things went very slowly. NMSU was given the task of implementing the regulations for the hemp program, and they developed some rules last fall. They had the rulemaking proceedings. I don't know if any of you were involved, but that's one thing if you're a leader in this industry and you really want to have an effect, is get involved with the rulemaking regarding the Department of Agriculture's oversight and NMSU's oversight of the hemp program. That's some of the strongest advice I can give you, because you can actually influence how the rules are made, and because you're on the ground and you're working in this industry, either medicinally or on the farms, your input will be greatly appreciated in that process. So then in, I guess it was December, January, applications started getting taken, and people are starting to grow. So congratulations. And here you are at the forefront of the whole process. Legally, everything is kind of up in the air, and I have to kind of give a disclaimer as an attorney because, first of all, the feds still consider cannabis to be a Schedule I illegal drug, so you have to always remember that under federal law. There are issues. And if you're in a medical cannabis state, Congress has defunded prosecution through the Rohrabacher Amendment, and that's been renewed for like 4 or 5 years now, that there's no prosecution. On the hemp side of things, there have been legal proceedings going on really since 2003 or so between the DEA and the Hemp Industry Association and other litigants regarding hemp status. And the early arguments that we were making that 0.03% or less, it's like basically it's the nightshade family. So, I mean, tomatoes could be classified as hemp according to the way the feds were looking at it. And so that's how that kind of started getting pushed, as that 0.3% issue, was that there were other plants that kind of fell into the same category as hemp. Now, of course, the FDA has approved the use of CBD last summer. It's actually a friend of mine who'd been working on that. It was one of his lifelong projects with GW Pharmaceuticals. And once that happened, of course, it opened up a whole new realm. Now, my friend, who's an attorney, Donnie Wertschafter, he's from Ohio, but he's worked in the hemp industry and the cannabis industry in Colorado and California. His thought was that, well, GW Pharmaceuticals and their group should be the only ones who should legally be selling CBD. So you can see they're advocating to the FDA and the DEA that they've gotten this approval, and so they should be the only ones, and everybody else, they're kind of upset about it because they spent, well over $100 million through the trials and testing and everything and the legal proceedings to make this happen. But that's obviously not what's happening. It's just so you know, there are like different views in the industry about this. The FDA just had its first rulemaking on CBD yesterday. So, and I don't know, maybe somebody can share with us if they've heard anything from what was discussed, but primarily what that was going to be focused on was packaging and quantity and quality and those kinds of issues, and like developing a set of regulations. So we had state regulations in New Mexico that were made last fall. Now the FDA is starting the process to develop federal regulations, and the deputy FDA commissioner who's in charge of this, I forget her name, but one of her comments was that she thought that there wasn't enough scientific evidence to support the CBD's medical use. So you can put input into that rulemaking as well. But that's kind of, I guess, what the evolution of hemp and CBD, cannabis, medical cannabis, that I can tell you legally in a nutshell in the time that I have today is. And if you are growing, for example, one thing to be aware of, the most recent legal issues that have come up is, and probably a lot of you know this, but there was a shipment of hemp that was headed from, I think it was Washington State. The seeds had come from Colorado. I think they were shipping it back to Colorado. And it was going through the state of Idaho, and this is about 2 months ago, and it was seized by the Idaho State Police because Idaho was not a friendly to hemp state. So if you're doing interstate shipments of hemp, be aware that this can happen. The people who had their hemp seized were called Big Sky Psi LLC, and they sued the Idaho State Police in the United States District Court for Idaho. This actually was decided on February 2nd, 2019, so it's been 3 or 4 months now. And the court, they were trying to get an injunction against the state police to let go their crop and to basically stand down. The court rejected that because getting a restraining order has a very high standard, much higher standard sometimes than just winning a lawsuit, for example. So that case is still ongoing, but different courts have kind of looked at this differently. The West Virginia court has looked favorably on interstate transport of hemp, but out here in the West, Idaho is one case where that was seized and not released back to Big Sky. So something to look out for if you're involved in interstate transport. So that's pretty much what I have to say, and I've got Daniel Salazar here with me today, who has worked with me on a lot of these issues. And if you have any questions for us, feel free to fire away. And I think earlier has anybody heard of what happened with the FDA hearings yesterday? Okay. So there should be some news coming down the road this week as to what was said. And that's important to look at, because obviously the FDA is now kind of leading the charge. The only other thing I think Daniel had pointed out to me before is that there's really a battle going back and forth between the FDA, the DEA, and they're saying, well, Congress, you need to pass some laws about this. And because they don't want to make administrative rules that legalize something. So that's how they've kind of backed away from it. But I guess the most important thing is that at this time is just be cautious. In the medical cannabis field and in this field, we've seen that the government can come in and they can seize crops, they can seize bottles on the store shelves. If you advertise CBD as addressing certain illnesses or ailments, just like with any other herbal remedy, they can come in and seize that. They can send you basically a letter, cease and desist letter. And there have been several famous cases, not just involving CBD, that happening in the last few years with home remedies and things like that. It's always been a problem. With Damiana, it was an issue. They made Damiana illegal for a while and made people take it off the shelves, and then they made people say that you can't use it to cure certain ailments and things like that. So, so that's what I would caution. And again, you can proceed at your own risk, and with the awareness that the climate is becoming more and more positive. And there's more and more pressure on the DEA and the FDA to back off of this because it's such a popular healing medication. It's really coming to the forefront of its role in human history because it's a miracle. And as more people find out, we're going to be having more conversations like this. So thank you very much.